Hi, this time I'm going to talk about the Fighting Fantasy PC game. Specifically, I'm going to talk about some things that I like concerning how it connects with the gamebook and the tabletop role playing game because it creates a sort of surreal experience as if you are playing a game within a game. Keep in mind that this review is not going to contain images or footage of the gameplay. I'm going to put a link in the description to the trailer, but there are many YouTube reviews showing you how the game is played, showing you all of those scenes in action, how the game goes about, the graphics and such. But I'm just going to make some comparisons as to how it reminds you of the game book and the tabletop role playing game, and I'm also going to give you my thoughts and opinions if it's worth getting the video game. It's going to be a bit similar to the review that I made for The House in Fata Morgana, one of the greatest visual novels of all time. In fact, I consider it to be one of the greatest works in literature, despite having some things that I would consider flaws in the writing style. I'm going to put a link in the description below to that review. Mm, so with this video, I want to encourage tabletop role players because those that are new to my channel focuses mostly on tabletop role playing games. I also talk about some board games and at times and war games and sometimes anime, but most of the time it's focused on tabletop role playing games. So I think that a lot of role players will enjoy the details and the way that these stylistic choices connect with the game mechanics so that it feels like you're actually playing the game book or at the tabletop role playing game. Now let's get started. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the graphics and sound. The graphics look great despite this PC game being somewhat low on the graphics department. You can play it on almost any computer and it's going to look awesome. And when it comes to the sound, it's very atmospheric. You have appropriate sound effects and music, and it really creates a really nice vibe to it. It feels like you are playing one of those classic fantasy experiences. Some people that are looking something a bit more modern, maybe they won't like the sound as much, but I still enjoy it. It feels quite slightly vintage, slightly retro. So when it comes to the immersion of how the game, it makes you feel as if you are actually playing the game book or the tabletop role playing game, it starts right away. From the first moment you are choosing your character, you feel like you have entered this sort of game room and you are choosing miniatures from your own collection or your friend's collection, depends. And you see all of these small buildings and trees, and they all have their bases. So it's pretty standard when it comes to the things that you would see in a tabletop role-playing game room or miniatures war game room. So it feels really cool. It feels as if you are just getting ready to play, perhaps with just a game master and a player. The game book aspect comes later on. In this game, you cannot create your character. You have a number of characters from which you can choose your hero for the adventure. And as you play, as you go through the dungeon itself, the Firetop Mountain, you will unlock other characters. You purchase them using these points that you win in the game. But there are also DLC characters. You can purchase some packages. I think one or two packages have been released. I'm not sure, and you can get more characters. And they are quite. There's a lot of variety to them. You see some characters that are a bit more monstrous. Some others are more focused on melee combat. Others are archer type of characters, spellcasters, assassins. So there's a character for every player, and it's pretty fun to play through the game using different characters. There's a decent amount of replayability based on that. Now, when it comes to these characters, and as I tell you, they look really cool with their miniatures and their base. They all have different powers and abilities. Each of their powers usually have a cooldown, at least the most special powers. So you never feel like you're playing the same experience concerning strategies and tactics. The characters play quite differently. I also like it that each character has a sort of background story that ties the character's quest to Firetop Mountain. If you do not know what Firetop Mountain is, that is the plotline. Well, it's basically you have this warlock known as Zagor that took control of Firetop Mountain. He basically expelled all of these dwarves, and he is now in control of Firetop Mountain. He has flooded the entire place with his army of monsters. And so, even though there are natural hazards, most of the enemies there serve Zagor. They are loyal to him. And you never know what this warlock is planning up next. So, each of the characters have their own unique reasons. Some characters are fighting for glory, others for riches, others for justice. So that's really awesome how they tie together the personal story of each character. It feels like you're actually playing a role-playing game, a tabletop experience, and you have the game master trying to tie each of the characters' background to the dungeon itself. So each of these characters will have a particular quest on how they wish to tackle Firetop Mountain. That is, some characters need to find a special item, some others need to talk with a non-player characters, some other needs to characters need to eliminate a certain threat within the dungeon. So that really adds a lot of depth to the entire thing. Although all of them will have as their main objective to defeat Zagor. And this review is going to be spoiler free. Unlike my other review of the tabletop module for Advanced Fighting Fantasy, I'm going to put a link in the description below in case you haven't watched that video, but that video will contain spoilers. This one I'm going to keep it like that without revealing information concerning the story, the plot twists and such, because it is truly an experience that is worth playing through with no knowledge whatsoever of the entire thing. Although if you have already played perhaps the Fighting Fantasy gamebook, the original 1982 gamebook, or maybe some other expression of Firetop Mountain through the Fighting Fantasy Classics app that you can play the books basically on your computer, or maybe you have played another video game, I forget the name, that also contains Firetop Mountain, or the DS game. I think you will still enjoy playing this PC game because there is some additional content and some surprises. Now, after you choose your character, you start moving into Firetop Mountain. And I think this looks great because you see your miniature just jumping about as if someone, a player in real life, is picking up the miniature and kind of like moving as if you were playing checkers or chess. You can even hear the tap when the base of your miniature makes contact with the table, so to speak. And as you are moving through the dungeon, you see these 3D tiles just dropping from above, and it feels like the game master is placing those 3D dungeon tiles that you can usually use if you want that sort of added realism within the table. So it all feels like you're actually playing a tabletop role-playing game experience. Now, when it comes to the game book side of things, this is mostly handled through encounters and descriptions and the story. As you are making progress and making choices through Firetop Mountain, you will see these pages of the book with the original illustrations of the 1982 game book. You can also choose if you want those illustrations to be colored. So if you wanted a more retro experience, you could deactivate this feature, but if you want to see the illustrations in color, it's very nice that they added that. You make skill checks just like the game book, rolling a couple of dice and getting a result. That's a bit on the random side of things. It's expected of Firetop Mountain, but it's still affected by your character's stats. Whenever combat initiates, it feels a lot like a tabletop role-playing game, but it feels that it leans more towards the wargame aspect because there are some limits within the battle encounter. That is, sometimes you will see features from the battlefield. Some of them can be destroyed, others you have to move around them. So that's the main difference when compared to a tabletop role-playing game, where you can attempt anything. So in a tabletop role-playing game, you could obviously, for example, if there is some sort of table or pedestal or whatever, if you cannot destroy it, maybe you can jump on top of it and perhaps get a bonus because you're attacking from higher ground. But in this case, only certain barrels and such can be destroyed. Mm, so that could take a bit away from the immersion that you are playing a tabletop role-playing game. But the battle system, I actually found it to be quite fun. It basically works in the following way. Each piece on the table, that is the enemies and the player character, they can either move or attack during each round. But there are also some special attacks that will allow you to move while you are attacking. Some attacks, for example, there is a character with a crossbow that can shoot and move to the side. Some characters can also move and attack, or attack and then move. So it becomes quite tactical because you're moving in this grid sort of battlefield. If you manage to attack your enemy from the flank or from behind, your attack hits automatically. But if your enemy attacks you while you're attacking that enemy at the same time, there's going to be a clash, and there's going to be an opposed check to see who wins and who deals damage to his opponent. But there are still some ways to predict when this is going to happen. First of all, movement happens before all other actions. So you need to calculate if the enemy is going to move from where it's standing or if it's going to be staying still. And you can notice this because the enemy figure kind of like wiggles a bit about. If it just moves without switching direction, it kind of like looks like the miniature is about to tumble or something. It means that the miniature is not going to move, but it's going to make an attack. But if it doesn't do that, you can predict that the enemy is going to move away from its space. So if an enemy is going to move and you attack that enemy, it's going to move first and your attack is going to miss. So you have to be perceptive of those things. You could also predict where the enemy is going to move. So if the enemy is looking, let's say, to the east, and you see that it did not wiggle, that means it's going to move forward to the east, one space forward, unless there is some sort of special effect that makes it move even farther. But you could attack in front of the enemy, even though it's an empty space, because the enemy is going to move. He's going to move exactly where your hit is going to land. So you will get an automatic hit. But like I said, there are many special attacks that attack other areas in front of you. Some spells attack like 3 squares in front of you or even farther. Some attack in a straight line. Some others are more like an area of effect sort of thing. So you have to keep all of those things in mind. If you some attacks allow you to hit several opponents at the same time, and things get quite dangerous. There are some huge foes like, let's say, Cyclops or a Minotaur, and they can basically charge at you and they deal a lot of damage. You need to move out of the way. So it's all about trying to figure out when the enemy is going to move, when that enemy is going to attack, and avoid clashes as much as possible, because otherwise you're going to be relying on luck, unless you know that your character is much more skilled than your opponent. Let's say you're fighting some sort of mindless beast that is not particularly strong. You could clash with a certain degree of comfort or certainty that you are going to win that clash. So combat does become quite tactical, and I like it that it feels a lot like a miniatures war game of sorts, or skirmish game rather. But it's a bit disappointing that you have some limits when it comes to the things that you can break and the things that you can interact with. And there is a limit, of course, when it comes to the battlefield. In a tabletop role-playing game, you could move outside of the battle. That is, if you're fighting in some sort of room within a building, you could decide to go upstairs or go outside of the building. So even though this is still happening within Firetop Mountain, it would be nice that you could have some options of moving outside of a particular room towards a corridor and such, but that would add a lot of complexity. That would have to add some reinforcements, some penalties, and also some bonuses based on that. So I think they actually did a great choice in keeping things simple, but that's, as I said, it steps away from that tabletop role-playing game sort of experience. Mm, Now, when it comes to the additional content, I think a lot of you will enjoy that content. Many veterans or grognards have played the original gamebook, and they may think that they can predict what is going to happen in certain rooms with certain choices. But here they add extra rooms and more enemies and challenges, and the entire thing looks so cool. It looks like a diorama because everything is handled as a sort of with a sort of miniature aesthetic to it. You see all of these miniatures with their bases, but also those different structures, castles, cabins, lakes, and rivers, and all of those tunnels, and they look like a diorama because everything is static. Even when you are fighting, you're only moving your miniature about. There is only a small animation for your attacks and spells, but it still feels like you're playing on a table, on a physical table. But the diorama aspect is really nice. I remember when I first saw this, and this I'm going to avoid describing too much of it because it falls on the spoiler category. But you see this new building added to the game, and it looked like yeah, well, like one of those miniature castles that you use in war games. It looked really nice. And so I think they managed to a good combination of combining the game book aspect with the tabletop role playing game aspect. I don't know if the designers are familiar with the Advanced Fighting Fantasy role playing game, which is the more recent version of Fighting Fantasy, but it feels a lot like that. I'm also going to put a link in the description below to my, it's a playlist of all of my reviews of Advanced Fighting Fantasy. So overall, what do I think of the Fighting Fantasy PC game? I think this is a must play for any Fighting Fantasy fan. Even if you have already played the game book, or you have played perhaps the adventure module with a game master, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain still contains many surprises. It's more of a classic fantasy experience. Some gamers that are looking for more modern sensibilities may not enjoy it. This is the typical story that you see this place full of dangers and horrible enemies, and you want to go in and take their stuff. And even though if you play the game thoroughly without looking for some extra secrets, you will still get a satisfying ending. But if, for those of you that want to be like completionists, there is a random element to things, where there are actually a couple of random elements. If you go into a certain labyrinth section, the labyrinth is always randomly generated. Some people hate this feature, some others like it. But if you're looking for surprises, that's one way of finding them within Firetop Mountain. And there are a few items, and many of you know what these items are for. That is those that have played the game book, or rather played the tabletop module, to get the best ending possible. And there's also replayability in the form of the characters that you are unlocking and those that you can purchase as DLC. And when it comes to my experience with the replayability of the game, I think there is a decent value, but after, let's say, 5 different playthroughs, things start to feel a bit the same. So I would recommend that you get this game when it's on sale. There have been multiple times where it's on sale on Steam, and that way you will feel like you're getting value for your money, because if you pay for it at full price and you do not fall in love with Firetop Mountain, you may feel like it was not worth it. So overall, if you enjoy the game book or if you play the tabletop role-playing game, I highly recommend that you get the the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I was thinking of the dungeon itself, because Firetop Mountain, it really comes to life with all of those miniatures and the atmosphere, and because you're reading the pages, it's a really surreal experience. The only video game that I feel like it compares to it, and it's not based on a popular property or something as famous within role-playing games as Fighting Fantasy, is Crimson Shroud for the Nintendo 3DS. Although that game disappointed me a bit, you still have those your characters moving as miniatures, and you see the polyhedral dice when you roll them, just like in this game you see dice when you roll them. In Crimson Shroud, to get the best ending, you need to go through the game once, so that you need to finish the game once, and then you need to rely on a completely random drop to get the best ending, unlike the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, where you can get the best ending right away from the very start, even though there is some randomness to it. The first playthrough, if you are lucky, you can get the best ending. So I highly recommend that you play it. Now, when it comes to my tabletop role-playing game reviews, for those that are interested, the next review is going to feature a work of fiction based on the setting of a post-apocalypse, very weird setting of a role-playing game that I reviewed a few months ago. I'm going to keep things a bit on mystery so that you are surprised by the review. I think you will enjoy it, especially if you like vampires. So many of you will probably guess what I'm referring to. Thanks again for watching this review, or review based on a comparison of how the game book and the tabletop role-playing game experience connect with this video game. And thank you to those that have been sending gift certificates via TTRPG. If someone wants to further support the channel, all the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.